Well, I am beyond honored to today welcome Professor Pat Dudgeon, whose work I've been familiar with for a number of years, and over the past couple of years, been able to have a few conversations with. But her contributions to mental health, to Aboriginal mental health, or as she coined, social emotional well-being, cannot be overstated. In the state that we're in, which is Western Australia, but really nationally and internationally. It's a real honor to have you here. Thank you for
My pleasure, Tony.
being here. I wonder if we could start by just hearing about you as a person, as an Aboriginal person, maybe where you're from.
I've lived and worked in beautiful Noongar Budja, so Perth is Noongar country, and I've been here since the early 80s. But because I came down to study psychology, I was actually born and grew up in Darwin in the Northern Territory, but my people are from the Kimberley, so that's north of Western Australia on the coast. So that's where my mob are from, and occasionally I go back to the Kimberleys, where my people are from. So I'm from the Bardi people of the Kimberley. But I always say a little part of my heart also belongs to Larrakia Nation, which is the Darwin Aboriginal groups, because I grew up there. But I did travel down here because there wasn't a university in Darwin at the time. Now there is, or there's a lot of higher education opportunities now. But I had to choose to go down south, as we called it, to study, and I wanted to do psychology. It was an interesting and hard journey studying psychology at a university. I got through, and luckily for me, I didn't realise I was actually the first Aboriginal psychologist to graduate. Yeah, so I'm glad I didn't know. I think I would have become paralysed with fear, had I known. But in any case, I came through, and it's been a bit of a journey. Then I chose to do psychology because I wanted to help people. But going through the system, going through university, there was no place for any Indigenous people in the theories, in the classrooms. We were not included. The discipline totally excluded us, and other cultural groups as well. So I think when I first started, I actually read some African American writings
Did you?
on psychology, and that opened my perception right up. Because before we were trying to see how we could fit Indigenous realities into white psychology, basically. And then I read black psychology, and they were just, throwing aside Western paradigms and saying we have to build our own paradigms and our own realities. So that was a big moment. I can still remember reading that particular journal. So after that, we realised then that if you tried to have a Indigenous white psychology, you'd always be a pale imitation,
Mm.
So you did need to step back and say, what are Indigenous knowledges and what are important for Indigenous people? And that was my journey. And also to critique mainstream psychology, because implicit in it, it's still a part of the colonising story, and there's racism in its concepts and in its systems and everything else.
Well, actually, it's interesting that you say that because I didn't know that there was another kinds of psychologies out there until I read your work about decolonizing psychology. And we were talking before about when exactly that was. I'm not sure, but it was long before I ever set foot here in Australia. It struck me at that time that it was like took a lot of creativity and boldness to think about how to create a new psychology. I'm curious to know because I mean, it was probably extremely obvious that you weren't included, that there were these things that didn't match with what you knew were part of your background. But it's a totally other thing to actually do something about that. So I'm curious, was there anything in your childhood or in your growing up that gave you a questioning or a creative kind of disposition?
Not really. I think it was the lived experience of discrimination and prejudice. There's lots of stories I could tell about my family and my people being excluded and looked down upon too, always looked down upon. And but I think I did originally, we were aware of that racism. I think people weren't naming it up so clearly and powerfully as we are now. But I did go into because I wanted to study psychology. I actually did anthropology as my minor, and I loved anthropology. That I changed direction and gone for anthropology because that actually had terms like ethnocentrism, and they did their research methodology was participant observation, and they were much more, still very Western, still the power stayed in white hands, but they were more open to self reflection than psychology was. It was, you had your outliers who questioned psychology, but I think they did it. It was not a very serious mm, um, uh, occupation at the time, and I think bit half-hearted, if you ask me. And so you did have your ones that oh, is there, what's psychology about? And then it wasn't probably until the 1990s that there was serious changes with critical psychology coming in. And, people like Isaac Prilatensky, who I've met and written chapters in his
Yeah.
books, and a whole range of different writers who started challenging the whole conception of psychology. And I can remember, I think it was Dave Parker, he wrote there, and very grounded people too, respectable. And he'd written, how do we know what personality is? It could be a flock of birds or, a cloud of rain. How do we really know? So they were starting, I mean, it does sound fanciful, and it was, but they were
But
starting
it
to
was
question.
questioning.
Yeah, they
Yeah.
were starting to question, because I think psychology's had a bit of an identity crisis. It always wanted to be a science, and so it became as empirical as it could. And even now in Australia, a lot of the schools of psychology in universities, they call themselves the schools of psychological science. So, so I think it's always yearned to be considered like a hard science, and it isn't. Sorry, but it isn't. And, maybe the neurological parts of it and the chemical changes in your brain, that's obviously, that could be considered scientific, but we're not going to, address some of the big problems we have being humans just using a scientific method. It has to be a bit more than that. But yes, so I probably lived through those
Yeah.
changes. And something, I don't know whether I'm making this up or not, Tony, I could be, but maybe it's true. There was something serendipitous that happened in the 90s, but
Yeah.
it was in 1995, so all these texts started coming out, and also our big Ways Forward report came out, and that's probably a foundational work in Indigenous mental health and
Could you
wellbeing.
talk about it a little more? Yeah, that was
Oh,
important.
that was it was pretty. So psychologists weren't really engaged in cross-cultural activities, or it was still from their own Western hegemony or hegemony. Been told. I call it hegemony. Some people call it hegemony. Anyway, they were psychologists never really questioned their Western hegemony as much as psychiatry and other. I think psychiatry is a bit ahead of the game in terms of trying to look at culturally inclusive discipline. But the Ways Forward was led by Professor Beverly Raphael and Pat Swan, an Indigenous mental health nurse. And they were fabulous people, and they did a big national tour talking to everyone about Indigenous mental health and what needed to happen. And they call the first big national conference on Indigenous wellbeing. I was actually a part of the consultations and also went to that conference. And then they delivered this report called ways forward. I'm sure there's more to it, but I'm blanking out at the moment. Anyway, they delivered this really fabulous report called Ways Forward, and that influenced a lot of the work that we did. It had built on work that had happened in the 70s, so our Indigenous health leaders were already calling for different approaches in health and by, subsequently mental health, but they were calling for holistic approaches. So some of Western thinking is to divide things up, to categorise them, to make sense of them. And they were saying, no, that doesn't fit us, You can't separate mind from body and this and that. We need holistic approaches, and relationships in there are important as well. So the Ways Forward report was a seminal moment in our history of Indigenous mental health and wellbeing. And then soon after that, the government. So the government's sort of been, trying to facilitate some change as well. They developed this big policy document called the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander People's Mental Health and Social and Emotional Wellbeing Framework. And that was developed, and I think a lot of the people that were involved in the Ways Forward were involved in this new framework. And then it was promoted, put out there, but nothing ever happened. So it was a brilliant document. So myself and other Indigenous psychologists, we took that report and all the other work that had been done, and we actually created this diagram of social and emotional wellbeing. So we captured all the important bits that had made SEWB, and that has become ubiquitous. It's everywhere, and mainly our own people love it. So that we're accountable to our people.
And we'll provide in the episode notes some links to that work, to the Way Forward report, but also to your work on social emotional well-being.
Yes.
And I think that would be actually a good place to go into some depth here, because I don't know that all of our viewers would be familiar with it. Obviously, if you spent any time here in Australia at all, you couldn't not be aware. But could you talk about the social emotional well-being model? And
Happy to, Tony. So basically what it is, and I see it as a new paradigm, a new way of looking at notions of self, and also service delivery. So we'd distilled from those the previous work, this diagram, and I remember we talked a lot. I delivered it to a conference of about 250 Indigenous social emotional wellbeing workers. And it sounds easy now, but at that time they were not suffering fools gladly. So, if you are inauthentic or not culturally appropriate, they'd kick you out the door. So they were a feisty group, but authentic. And so my colleague actually went and hid in her. I don't know if I should be saying, oh, bugger, it makes it interesting.
Yeah.
My colleague actually...
I've never known you to hold back.
Yeah, my colleague went and hid in her hotel room because she was so nervous. But I thought, no, I can, I'm feeling confident. So
So let me just stop. So there was already this kind of, some of the language of social emotional well-being, but there wasn't really yet
a model,
an articulated model.
Yes.
Yeah,
so okay. I presented the model. They loved it.
They did.
Yeah, so I was confident. If I was anyway a bit apprehensive, I would have been hiding in the
hotel room
the hotel room as well. And then other colleagues, because there was a group of Indigenous psychologists who came together to develop the model, and they presented it at different particularly Indigenous, because we were really concerned that we could do something useful for our people. So we knew that white psychology and mental health did not fit us. And it seemed at that time that the Ways Forward report and the SEWB framework was a bit far away. So this was us trying to distill that knowledge to make it useful for our community. That's
really interesting, yeah.
So that was our intention. And it's just, we had a chapter in the Working Together book. And since then, it's just become an important concept in its own right. at the second iteration of the SEWB framework, as we called it, the government took our model out to as a discussion point, and we said, yes, please take it. But feed back to us, any thoughts from the community. And they did. We adjusted the model a little bit because we'd put holistic SEWB in the middle, and the community said, oh, well, that's a bit, self, already explained. Put self in the middle. So we did, because we were probably shying away from using self because it was so, Western self was just so very isolated and not a relation. It's a relational self. So that's probably why we shied away. We had also put connection to land, and people said, no, put country, but with a capital C. And so I'll segue now into describing what our model was.
Before you do, though,
okay.
I just wanted to highlight something that's pretty important here, which is that it's not common that when people, especially sort of academic people, develop a model, that they are very focused on what the community thinks about it.
Yes.
It does seem like at every step of the way, it was really important to, does this actually personally resonate? Am I right that that's been an important preoccupation?
Yes,
Yeah.
and most of our work that in fact, all of our work that we do, include as many Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people, in the very beginnings of it. So we're very concerned with co-design. So even though we're Aboriginal, it doesn't give us a magical pass. We need to go and talk to people and include them in the development of any idea, program or service, and do it in a good way too, not a tokenistic way. And I'll talk about that when we talk about suicide prevention and our SEWB report that we did.
Yeah.
But with social and emotional wellbeing, and again, I want to say something, because even though I'm really committed to social and emotional wellbeing, it's not the only model out there. There's going to be other models, and that's what we have to not hang our egos, which is easy to say, hard to do. But we have to be careful not to hang our egos on the model that we developed and think it's going to be the be-all and end-all. Right now it's useful and it's reflective of people's realities, but I want to see other models come about, emerge, that local ones. And I think that, there's, at the moment, it suits everyone. It suits the government too. They're looking at doing initiatives and funding based on that model, but it's not the only model. There'll be others that we need to make room for other Indigenous knowledges to come through.
Yes, even just that is, I think, a rare thing to hear.
Easy to say, hard
for
to
people
do.
to say, well, but for people to say this thing that I developed, because obviously if you developed it, it's because you think it has a lot of value, right? You wouldn't put it out there if you didn't think it was good.
Yes.
I mean, I just wonder where does that come from? That, I guess, humility about your work. Where does that come from in you?
It is the experience of academic oppression, if you like, or intellectual oppression. If we're serious about nurturing Indigenous knowledges, we can't repeat what's been done to us. We can't oppress our people in any way, including intellectually, if we want, everyone to be to have social justice and to live thriving lives. So
that's profound.
So we just have to make, one day the SEWB model will no longer be useful. I think there'll be more complex and deeper models, and they might all be local. Much of it might be local, and that's okay as well. But at the moment, it serves its purpose, and I think for me and the other Indigenous psychologists who developed it, we're really happy with that. And we did do it. We were very clear that this was for our people. And we're happy it's become so popular.
Sure.
But there'll be other models that come forward too. And I can see them, like, in the Kimberley, they've got a notion of self where Lian is important, and that's sort of a soul spirit. And so they're starting to develop that up. And Professor Helen Milroy, who's our first Indigenous psychiatrist, she's got a model of wellbeing called Dance of Life. So so there's other, and they're the ones off the top of my head that I can mention. But there's a lot more going happening. There's a lot more happening, and yeah, it'll be an interesting.
And you celebrate that, and
Yes.
and want that, yeah.
Yeah, and globally as well.
It'd be really, oh yeah. There's a lot of work happening around the world, and even in our country.
Yes, so we actually have a really great person I've met, and I need to make time to go overseas. Is Mark Standing Eagle Bayes. He's the chair of the Native American Psychologist Association, and we've actually had him here. Our Indigenous psychs invited him over to keynote at our Indigenous Suicide Prevention Conference.
Oh yeah, I'd love to look into that.
Yeah, he's got this method called the sweetgrass method of research, of, braiding together the best of Western knowledge and the best of Indigenous knowledges to come up with solutions. So very interesting
I'd
work
love to
happening.
meet him. Yeah, maybe you can help me meet him.
Yeah.
So now let's get into the model itself.
Oh, okay, the model.
The model.
Okay, the model, basically, it's a notion of self, and it can be used for service and also for policy. But it's a notion of self, where self is in the centre, but we're made up not only of our connections to our mind and emotions, so that's part of, you being a human being, but also to our physical selves, and there's risk and protective activities we can do to make those healthier and more thriving. But where it probably departs, the model departs from Western thought, is that as importantly is our connection to our family. So family is very big for Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people, very important. So our connection to our family, and then the other important connection, or domain we call them, is connection to community. But families will usually make up community. So, it'd be, it's good when we have healthy, inclusive communities. Then there's a connection to culture, so our cultural activities that we still do. And I think that we need to write more and celebrate that. We see that there's been this amazing reclamation of cultural activities that's happened in Australia. And so I think part of the process of colonisation was to destroy that. And they went underground. I can remember about 35 years ago when I was working at Curtin University, we were looking for Noongar speakers to teach staff Noongar language, and at that time I couldn't find anyone. Maybe I didn't look very well enough. There are now Noongar, Noongar language has, flourished. So I think we end up getting a Wongai speaker to come in and teach staff Wongai language. But it was difficult. Now you can, Noongar language is everywhere. It's so fabulous to see all these languages being reclaimed. So your connection to your culture and cultural activities, your connection to your country with a capital C, so where you come from, is very important. And also that's part of, so the protective factor is often people will go back to country to heal or regroup or strengthen their cultural identity. Connection to country and connection to your spirituality and your ancestors. So those are important domains that make up a healthy, functioning human being. But that's not on its own. So Graham G, our colleague who worked, he actually led the chapter on the social emotional wellbeing model. He said, well, it's not static too, it's how we experience these things and how we express it. So that's what makes it all happen.
Experiencing and then expressing.
Yeah,
So
expressing
this kind
the connection to country.
a flow.
Yeah, so it is an active part, notion of self. But it's not in isolation behind it, and that's really important for us too. is that there are other determinants, like historical determinants. We come from a history of colonisation, and I think yesterday was National Sorry Day. And, when I was growing up, no one spoke about the stolen generations, for instance. And the stolen, for international listeners,
Yeah.
stolen generations isn't just exclusive to Australia. It also happened in other countries, and I know in the US and in Canada, they had residential schools where Indigenous children were sometimes very forcibly removed from families and communities, and the aim was to civilise them so they'd become, productive and contributing members of society. Obviously, they did not occupy the upper echelons of society. They would be seen as the slaves and the servants of white society.
I have to say, I'm ashamed to say this, but I only learned about these literally 2 years ago. There's a colleague named Dean Seneca, who's of the
Ah,
Seneca people, which is the land that where I come from, and I never heard about this. I was I was shocked, and the fact that I'd gone through quite a bit of education, but never really learned. I mean, I don't know. Maybe I was closing my eyes, but I think it just also wasn't there.
it wasn't there. That's why, like truth telling is important. And
Mm.
we've got some of our states, Victoria, for instance, they've got the big truth telling
Yeah,
commission.
I didn't know.
So telling the truth about what happened, even the massacres and that happened to our people. I don't know about America
Yeah,
that
same.
seemed to express, the resistance that Native Americans
Yes.
put up for Australia. That was wiped out too. It was like, they were sitting on
Yeah.
their butts and they just sat there looking at us dozily as we came in and saved them by civilising them. They didn't speak about the big resistances that happened across the country.
Yeah.
That's only recent news.
And yeah, I think since I've been spending so much time here, I've just learned so much. And there's I know that there's a lot of dialogue happening back and forth between the countries, but I think there's also, but for example, I know that this week is Reconciliation Week.
Yes, yes.
We don't have that kind of concept, but I wonder if you could, for people who might not know about Reconciliation Week, don't live in Australia, if you could explain maybe not what it is and
Oh,
what does it mean to you?
yeah, specifically, I know that it's separate to National Sorry Day. So National Sorry Day is when we do remember, I won't say celebrate, when we remember the stolen generations in particular, because there were some big reports that were done, like bringing them home, and we know that I think, a huge percentage of Aboriginal people were forcibly removed. That happened in my family. So my mother was she was removed to Beagle Bay mission in the Kimberley, so she was put into a mission, and that had it was a Catholic mission, so it was very much about imposing Christianity and all the rest onto the people who grew up in the mission. But she stayed in her own country, which was fantastic. So she said, she was always grateful that she could, in the mission, she could see her aunties and her mimmies and her people there. So when I read the native welfare records, because there was this great deal of surveillance on Aboriginal people in Western Australia in particular, we got the native welfare records about my mother and my grandmother, and they were very zealous. I think the native welfare protectors, as they were called, and they were actually talking about sending my mother and my aunt down south to Moore River Settlement. And my blood red cold. These are girls from
Yeah.
the Kimberley who wouldn't have coped coming down to a winter
Colder,
and
yeah.
different Aboriginal people. It would have just been, a real hardship. So for some reason, the records ended and they didn't end up sending them. But it just made me very upset that, on a government whim, some government worker said, oh, well, we should send these two down south, and it could have happened. So, you know, there was no way of objecting. But we do have the records of all that activity when the surveillance was on. And it was like Aboriginal people were they were like on governor's parole in their own country or in concentration camps. And if you made trouble and didn't follow all the rules, bad things could happen to you. You know, you could be sent. My grandmother, for instance, because she wouldn't listen and she did what she wanted to do. And so they sent her to this cattle station out in the middle of nowhere. And it was like being imprisoned on governor's pleasure. And she wrote these letters. First of all, they were indignant because, you know, she was mission trained and grown up. So, you know, she was writing letters saying this is, you know, not fair and I shouldn't be here, blah, blah, blah. And then after a couple of years, they became begging letters. So, there was no power, and not for doing anything specific, just because you wouldn't follow the rules, you know. So, Indigenous people have gone through a lot, and that you could have your children taken away like that as well. So, you know, when we talk about, you know, when I talk to a lot of non-Indigenous people, they say, oh, you're carrying on about the past. You know, we should start right now and forget about the past. You can't. It's very much what has shaped Indigenous Australia today. And also, it's not like that's in the past and then there's this cut-off where, you know, white Australia becomes all, we're going to treat you like equals. That ain't happening, I can tell you right now. There's racism and disadvantage that continues. We know there's been studies done of the police and the hospitals and how they treat Indigenous people,
disparities there.
and you know the unconscious bias, and Indigenous people do a lot worse. Sometimes Indigenous people make up more than 50% of any prison population or in lockups when they're being arrested. And it's not because Indigenous people are innately criminal. It is because there is unconscious bias and, you know, lack of good positive solutions.
You know, this might be a place to talk about suicide and suicide prevention,
Yes,
because that's another place where, you know, where Aboriginal people are disproportionately
very
affected.
much. Yes.
And you've had major contributions in that area as well. I wonder what you'd want to say about suicide and suicide prevention, what you see as needed.
Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander suicide is different. I think we have to be careful sometimes when we talk about suicide in general, because, you know, every suicide is a person who's chosen not to be here. And one of the things I've seen that's a change that's happened is that the government is treating suicide in general differently. They now talk about social determinants in suicide prevention. They never used to before. It was always a clinical issue, and in it, implicit in it, was blame the victim, that there was something wrong with people. That's why they took their lives and so on. You know, the shame of suicide, not understanding that, you know, sometimes people are just too sensitive, or, you know, life is too challenging, and they make a decision which I'm positive they don't, you know, they might, had they been given an extra time and a safe space to go to, they may not have made that decision. So suicide to me is important for all of us, or suicide prevention. Indigenous suicide is different. So it started happening years ago, and I see it as probably the consequences of those changes that I spoke about, the historical changes, ongoing racism. You know, I can remember calling a big meeting to talk about racism because it wasn't on the table, and I was thinking, no, it hasn't gone away, it's still here. So we actually did the Australian Psych Society. They did come to that, and we called it the Boat Shed Declaration. And we said that we would fight against racism back in the time. But now it's become so obvious, and we've had some really big issues. And but anyway, back to suicide prevention. The point I was making is that it is an oppressive society for a lot of Aboriginal people. Most Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people to go up in. There's a lot of racism, direct, indirect, also systemic. So systems are racist as well. You know, they do not include Indigenous people in any way. So we've got the historical trauma that's happened to us, and we know, for instance, stolen gens people, they're very vulnerable. You know, suicide rates are higher, psychological distress is higher in those groups of people because often they've been institutionalised, cut off from their country and people, and sometimes abused as well. So, so those things are part of our current, you know, situation in contemporary times, and you can't cut it off unless you're going to totally change the systems that we live in. So they're a reality, and suicide was not happening, wasn't as prevalent when I was a child, and then it became very prevalent. And members of my big extended family started taking their lives, and I'd avoided it because I thought it was just too heartbreaking and complex. So I'd pretty well ignored suicide. Then it came into my immediate family. So that's when I thought, right, you know, we've got to do something. So I spoke to my cousins and family members, and it wasn't, yeah, there might have been some mental health or a little bit of clinical issues, but our people that we'd lost to suicide, they'd had hard lives, you know. They'd struggled, they'd tried to do the right thing and live a good white life, but, you know, society didn't give them a chance. So we felt that very strongly, that it wasn't their fault that they had taken their lives. So the government had given us a small grant. So we went up to the Kimberleys, which is and was the big suicide hotspot, and we trained co-researchers. So they went out to the communities of Beagle Bay, of Broome and of Halls Creek, and spoke to the people, you know, what do we do about suicide prevention? Because so this is going back some time.
What did you learn from that?
Oh, lots. That firstly, and then that was duplicated later on nationally. But people were concerned. They were very concerned about suicide and suicide prevention. They didn't see it as a big clinical issue. It was the, you know, some people felt that, you know, there needed to be clinical solutions, but what they saw is the need for self-determination and also cultural solutions. So at that time we'd met Professor Michael Chandler, and he had done a lot of work with First Nations people in Canada. And so that was our evidence base. It really resonated with us. And I checked with Canadian scholars later, and they said, yeah, it would have been nice if he hadn't a First Nations researcher by his side, but he was pretty good. His work was good. So they looked at suicide, him and his colleagues looked at suicide across First Nations tribes, and they found that when they disaggregated all the statistics, that some tribes had high rates that were totally off the chart, and then others had hardly any. So he called it the sawtooth effect, that, you know, they weren't, when you disaggregated, different pictures emerged. So they actually went into the communities that had no or little suicide and found out, they'd analysed everything that was happening, found out what was happening for those communities, and they came up with what they call cultural continuity measures, and they were things boiled down in a nutshell, and I'm sure we'll put the link for people to read it in some detail. But boiled down, if communities had some measure of self-determination, like they were in charge of their own, you know, civil services, childcare services and whatnot. So they had some self-determination. Women on boards was on the council board was another one, which showed that unfortunately I wouldn't say the magical influence of women, but it showed that that community was fair and inclusive. So women on council, and if communities were engaging in some type of cultural activities, so that they were, you know, reinstating powwows or building a longhouse. So those were important elements. So that resonated with us, and we thought, we knew it. That's the solution. So that influenced our work very much. So we'd done a small research in the Kimberley, and then we were asked to do a national study. And so we did the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Suicide Prevention Evaluation Project, Solutions That Work, what the evidence and our people tell us. And that took about 2 years and a half. And we did a big, literature review, program review.
And that was another milestone.
Yeah, that was a
kind
big
of
milestone.
milestone of paper.
And so then we went out because we couldn't resist. We thought, it feels weird that we're not talking to people out in the community. So we thought, let's go out. So we did 12 workshops across the country. And we were a bit apprehensive because, a lot of Aboriginal people say, we've been consulted, and then nothing ever changes. So we were worried that we were just going to be another brick in the wall, asking questions, and then no change
I've heard
coming.
that a lot.
We went out, and then finally we developed this excellent report, and we presented that to ministers at Parliament House. And that has been a great success. So that impacted on a lot of policies, how they were funding suicide prevention, and it did what it needed to do to change things for our people. So we're very proud of that report.
It must be. It must be, yeah. So I would really be interested to hear about what projects you have on that you are most excited about right now.
Okay, Tony, there's a few, but in particular, I probably would mention two. One's a big one that I don't think it's world first. It's a world first. So we started this project. I think it was started in 2013, where we brought together some academics who were our allies, and we decided we wanted to change psychology. So we wanted to increase the number of Indigenous psych students, and we wanted to put Indigenous studies into the psych curriculum. And so we wrote some reports, got some frameworks out, and then our grant ended and we all went separate ways. It did start influencing the competencies of psychology, though. And then we'd won another grant, a big research grant, and I thought, let's revive that old project. And I did have visions of myself meeting up with my colleagues at conferences and, writing papers to challenge the Western hegemony of psychology and whatnot. But I thought it'd just be a small group of us who have conversations and fight the power, if you like. But the response was amazing. Everyone wanted to be a part of it. So the Australian Indigenous Psychology Education Project is flourishing. We have 80% of, over 80% of schools of psychology have signed up to it. And so a part of our process is we have a community of practice where senior people in schools of psychology are invited to come to regular meetings.
Wow.
And we don't judge. If people can only do one lecture, that's okay. Maybe there's other forces against them. But there's a whole lot of resources that are available. It's actually changed the competencies for psychology, which is going to be very interesting. So they're out right now, and they've got very strong competencies about understanding in other cultural diverse groups, in particular Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people. So this project is amazing. Our executive committee are all the regulators of psychology. So, the Australian Psych Society, the heads of schools of psychology, the Accreditation Council, I think they're a member. But the respect and support we have is quite amazing. And I can see your questioning face saying, what changed?
No.
Because I was suspicious when everyone was saying
that's
I
exactly
thinking,
what I was wondering.
I was thinking, what the hell is going on?
Yeah.
And what I figured it out is that in that time between the two projects, that a lot of the old and probably limited thinkers in the discipline had retired. So they'd gone out to field, and we had this new group come through who actually were progressive and who wanted our discipline to be different and inclusive. So I think what we saw was a generational change happen. So we're really pleased with that, and with this particular project, and it's doing really well, and it's being led now by a wonderful young Nyunga clinical psychologist. Mm.
I could imagine that's a huge legacy.
Yes, it
I
is.
mean, that could change the field
Oh, it
ongoing.
has, it has. So,
Yeah.
there's been special editions of the Australian Psychologist, our journal. Bell and other Indigenous psychs have been responsible for that. We had a whole chapter in one of the big, most comprehensive introductions to Australian psychology. So we had a whole chapter, and the Maori people had a whole chapter too, because it was for Australia and New Zealand. So it was good, to have our
Yeah.
colleagues as
Oh, that
on
is
it as
really
well.
exciting, yeah. Oh,
That
that's
we're not just a footnote. In previous times, we were, a little footnote or a little box with Indigenous psychology. Now we're like a big chapter in our own right.
yeah, yeah.
And so we're really excited. We have publishers approaching us to consider doing a book in Indigenous psych. So
Oh, that's huge. That's
we're
huge.
very happy. But that's the other one's very important as well. And that's a brilliant example of co-design with the Indigenous community. And I know that Maureen Lewis and the Western Australian Mental Health Commission is a part of the podcast, and I've got to tip my hat to them, because what they did this, in amongst all the projects that they're responsible for, is that they decided that they thought social and emotional wellbeing was very important for Indigenous communities. So they made a nicely amount of money available and said, we're going to fund social and emotional wellbeing through the Aboriginal medical services. And then they sat down with our state coordinator of all the AMSs, and they talked about how they would use the resource to empower Aboriginal community-controlled health services. And so 5 sites were funded across the state. We were actually asked to evaluate, so we've sent our staff in to not evaluate in a punitive way. It's been a quality improvement way, and supporting the whole process. And those different AMSs have different there's some fundamental things that are uniform or the same, but there's also differences, and we need to nurture those differences because the whole process of colonisation, characteristics of communities are different. So their Aboriginal medical services reflect that. So that, I think, the co-design of that, and I'm optimistic that it'll be continued to be funded. But that, I always hold that up as a classic example, because sometimes people say, oh, that's all very well and good in theory, but how can governments co-design with Aboriginal people? And this is a good example. It's sharing the power and supporting Indigenous self-determination.
That's really encouraging. That's
Oh,
really encouraging. When you're speaking about education, I just want to take a little, I guess, diversion here for a minute. When it comes to the education of non-Indigenous mental health professionals,
yes.
what do you think is important for um, non-Indigenous mental health staff and professionals and peers, maybe in mainstream services, to
Um,
know and learn?
Okay, I think they need to learn about Aboriginal people. It's amazing, and I think this is the same in the US. The number of people who've never met an Indigenous person, or they might know one that went to the shops down the road or whatever, but they've not actually met anyone. So I think that is a problem. Um,
So just prioritize
yeah,
plain old
yeah, get to know them more.
knowing people, having
And
friends.
they might be a bit wary, or a bit reserved initially, but I think if you go in with a good heart, and particularly if you're a professional, know the history and cultural difference, because that makes a big difference. It's little things sometimes to respect other people as human beings, and to respect that they Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people are the original people of this country going back to more than 60,000 years. You know, the archaeology evidence keeps changing, but to say there's a longer time period that, you know, we were here through an ice age. Find out about the history, support the local organisations, media organisations. It's almost like there's two different worlds. There's an Indigenous world that's really rich and thriving. Find out and be a part of it.
Maybe we can turn for a minute to the future. You have contributed so much, and you still are. I mean, it feels like, some of these projects that you just described are kind of just getting going.
Mm.
So I'm curious what you see as, as you look forward into 5, 10 years ahead for social emotional well-being, for um, Aboriginal Torres Strait Island people, and their health and well-being. What do you see in the future?
I probably neglected to say that social emotional being can be a paradigm that's very useful for non-Indigenous people as well. And I know some of my psychologist colleagues have used it with their non-Indigenous clients, and I thought, oh, that's good, but what about connection to country? Because for me, it's like I'm from the Bardi people. And it's interesting, this Indigenous psychologist said, we are all connected to country. We are all children of this earth, and we dig our feet into the soil, and we're connected, and that is our healing. So he looked at connection to country in a broader
Broader.
way, which I was very touched by and respect. So I think, we're talking some of our, Professor Helen Milroy's work is looking at the role of traditional or cultural healers in well-being, and that role could be extended to non-Indigenous people as well. So I think what I'd like to see in the future that any person, I'll focus on Indigenous, but non-Indigenous people also should have this, can go to their local Aboriginal medical service, and if they're feeling a bit down about their cultural identity, they could sign up for workshops that will take them back to country and do activities, and or women's group to do cultural activities there, or sports, or they could enrol in a program which talks about healthy eating and exercise, or there could be cultural healers who come through. So, what days are there available? Could I book in for a session? That's what we do at our conferences. So we have the Nunkri healers usually at our conferences, and people will book in and they'll do some healing on people, and they really appreciate that. They love it. And non-Indigenous people as well. So I think, obviously some of us have big challenges, and sometimes we might need to have medication and quiet places to go and to recover and give families a chance. But to not throw away those neither. I don't think we throw out the baby with the bathwater, but we always look to reintegrating people back into a healthy family and community.
Hmm. I can't help going there because you mentioned before that it's something that you care a lot about. Can you? And it does seem connected to country, climate change.
Yes.
Tell me about your thoughts and where your passions lie.
The way us as humans, and I'm putting myself in there too, because I'm as much as a consumer as everyone else, but the way that we have mistreated and exploiting the earth is now coming to back to
Back
haunt
to
us.
us, yeah.
So we're looking at the consequences of that, and we see that in flooding. Australia itself.
Bushfires.
Yeah, Australia's all the animals that have gone extinct in Australia is phenomenal. So I think we know things are not good, and I think that's a source of anxiety for a lot of our youth. But it's the little things that count. We should be doing big actions, but I can remember when range-free eggs were like a bit, ooh, that's very yuppie, and people were scathing about it. But people were concerned too that we were exploiting fowl. So now it's very common, and I won't buy eggs or eat them if they aren't. So through our consumerism, we can actually impact on some climate change. Obviously, it needs much more. What I'm seeing is that a return to how Indigenous people lived with the environment, and that was a oneness that you didn't exploit, that you lived in harmony with the country. And we know now, before, I think a lot of the Indigenous knowledges has been discredited. So we're seeing a revival of Indigenous knowledges across a whole range of different areas, but particularly in how we live on Earth. And one good example is the bush burning that's happening. So there was an article in the papers recently about Arnhem people who do all this bush burning to control bushfires. So if you do a little bit of burning, then the big fires won't come. But the Victorian Indigenous community has started that, and that's part of their firefighting strategy. So
kind of from that heritage comes
yes,
leadership in this important
yeah.
time.
And there's a big part of I think all the states have this, but Indigenous Rangers. So they're people who are working out on country, and they've got very important jobs now. They will count for animals, local animals, keep an eye on things, and they're responsible for caring for country. So I love the Indigenous Rangers program, and it gives local community people meaningful work that's still connecting to their culture and country.
So what's next for you?
Well, I've actually come to a place where I was on a lot of committees and councils, which was really important. But I think that there's a lot of other Indigenous people out there who can, equally fill those roles. So I've actually started standing down from a lot of councils and committees. And what I'd like to do is just do research with the community and write papers and be stress-free, which is, I don't know, a bit of a fantasy. I
Dream, yeah,
suppose
yeah,
it's a
yeah.
dream, but yeah, that's what I'm aiming towards.
Yeah, well, I hope you will write many papers.
Yes.
The ones that you've written so far have been really influential. I know
Oh,
for me, as well as thousands of people, and the impact that you've had in in the field, and I know in this state, but also across the country is yeah, really second to none. So I appreciate the chance to sit here with you, have a yarn a bit, and I look forward to more times like this.
okay. Thank you, Tony.
Thank you.